Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight, we step into the shadowed streets of New Orleans in 1858, during Holy Week, a time meant for repentance and mercy, yet tied to one of the most disturbing stories whispered through history. This is the tale of Esther, an enslaved woman whose name became linked to an unthinkable act that shattered a slaveholding household and left a stain of fear, guilt, and unanswered questions in 1858. New Orleans stood as one of the most powerful and contradictory cities in the United States, a place where immense wealth and unbearable suffering existed side by side. As the largest slave market in the Deep South, the city thrived on human bondage. Enslaved men, women, and children were bought and sold openly near churches, cafes, and elegant townhouses, their lives reduced to ledgers and prices. Catholicism shaped daily life, especially during Holy Week, when bells rang, candles burned, and sermons spoke of sacrifice, forgiveness, and divine judgment. Yet behind the stained glass windows and processions, cruelty flourished. Slave quarters were hidden just beyond manicured courtyards, and violence was often disguised as discipline. Fear ruled both sides. Enslaved people lived in constant terror of punishment, separation, and death, while slaveholders feared rebellion, poisonings, and vengeance. This uneasy balance created a city thick with silence, superstition, and whispered threats, where a single act could shatter the illusion of control. It was within this deeply religious yet brutal world that Esther lived, endured, and ultimately became part of one of New Orleans' darkest legends. In 1858 New Orleans, Holy Week was the most solemn and emotionally charged period of the Christian calendar, especially within the city's deeply rooted Catholic culture. Beginning with Palm Sunday and ending on Easter, these days were devoted to mourning Christ's suffering, reflecting on sin, and seeking redemption. Churches were draped in dark cloths, bells fell silent, and candlelit services filled the air with incense and whispered prayers. Processions moved slowly through the streets, reenacting betrayal, sacrifice, and death, reminding the faithful that judgment and mercy walked hand in hand. For enslaved people, Holy Week carried a painful contradiction. Sermons preached compassion and forgiveness, yet those same messages were delivered by institutions that upheld slavery. Enslaved men and women were expected to observe the rituals, attending Mass, kneeling in prayer, fasting, while remaining bound to a system that denied their humanity. The suffering of Christ was invoked to encourage obedience and endurance, often twisted into a warning that rebellion against earthly masters was rebellion against God Himself. This made Holy Week a time of intense psychological pressure. Guilt, fear, hope, and despair collided. Many believed these days carried heightened spiritual power, that sins committed during Holy Week invited divine wrath, while acts performed in its shadows were forever cursed. Any violence during this sacred time was seen not merely as a crime, but as a direct offense against heaven. That is why the act later attributed to Esther struck such deep terror. It was said to have occurred during the very days meant to honor sacrifice and salvation, transforming Holy Week from a season of redemption into one of horror and sacrilege. Esther's life unfolded within the rigid and merciless structure of slavery in mid-19th century New Orleans, where an enslaved person's existence was controlled from birth to death. She was considered property, valued for labor, obedience, and silence, rather than as a human being with thoughts, pain, or fear. Like many enslaved women in urban households, Esther's days were filled with exhausting domestic work, cooking over open fires, cleaning large homes, laundering clothes by hand, tending children who were not her own, and remaining constantly available to her enslavers' demands, day and night. Beyond physical labor, Esther endured psychological captivity. Enslaved women were especially vulnerable, living under constant surveillance and threat of punishment. They had no legal protection against violence, humiliation, or exploitation. Any resistance, spoken or silent, could be met with beatings, sale, or separation from loved ones. Family bonds among enslaved people were fragile. Children could be sold away without warning, and marriages held no legal recognition. This created a life shaped by grief, suppressed rage, and unspoken trauma. Religion was often forced upon Esther as both comfort and control. She was taught to pray, to kneel, to accept suffering as God's will, and to believe obedience would bring heavenly reward. Yet the contrast between sermons of mercy and the cruelty of daily life carved deep wounds. Over time, silence became survival. Emotions had to be buried, fear mastered, and anger swallowed whole. By 1858, Esther was not simply an enslaved woman. She was the product of years of confinement, loss, and invisible suffering. Her inner world remains largely unknown, erased by history's silence. But within that silence, pressure built. And in a city already trembling with fear and superstition, her life in bondage formed the dark foundation for what would later be remembered as an unthinkable act. The master's household in 1858 New Orleans was a carefully maintained illusion of order, respectability, and Christian virtue, especially during Holy Week. From the outside, such homes appeared disciplined and God-fearing, with children raised in prayer, meals taken on schedule, and strict social hierarchies observed without question. But beneath this polished surface lay a world defined by power, control, and constant tension. In this household, authority was absolute. The master's word was law, enforced through fear rather than fairness. Enslaved people moved quietly through corridors and courtyards, expected to anticipate needs before they were spoken, and to disappear when no longer required. Any mistake, spilled food, delayed service, a perceived look of defiance could invite punishment. Discipline was often inconsistent and unpredictable, making fear a permanent presence rather than a temporary response. The children of the household were both symbols of innocence and instruments of power. They were taught from a young age that enslaved people existed to serve them, to obey them, and to endure their whims. What appeared as childish behavior could carry cruel consequences when directed at those who had no right to refuse. For an enslaved woman like Esther, caring for the master's children meant living in a constant state of emotional contradiction, required to show affection and devotion while being reminded daily of her own disposability. Religious observance intensified these dynamics. During Holy Week, the household emphasized prayer, moral purity, and obedience, yet cruelty did not pause for holiness. Instead, discipline was often justified as righteous correction, framed as necessary to maintain God's order. This blending of faith and dominance created a suffocating environment where mercy was preached but rarely practiced. Within these walls, resentment, fear, and suppressed rage quietly accumulated. Silence became mandatory, trust non-existent. The household functioned not as a family, but as a hierarchy sustained by intimidation. And it was inside this tightly controlled, spiritually charged space that the tension reached its breaking point, setting the stage for a tragedy that would forever stain the household's legacy. In 1858 New Orleans, what happened inside a slaveholding home rarely reached the outside world in clear detail. Instead, truth traveled as rumor, fragmented, whispered, and reshaped by fear. Behind the closed doors of the master's household, tension lived quietly but constantly, pressing down on everyone within its walls. Enslaved people were expected to endure suffering in silence, yet silence itself became a breeding ground for suspicion and dread. Cruelty was not always loud or visible. Sometimes it appeared as deliberate neglect, calculated humiliation, or psychological torment that left no marks but carved deep wounds. Punishments could be sudden and arbitrary, delivered without warning, ensuring that fear never faded. Enslaved women, especially those working inside the home, were exposed to relentless scrutiny. Every movement was watched, every expression judged, every perceived failure remembered. Even moments of stillness could be interpreted as defiance. Among the enslaved community, whispers circulated late at night, stories of harsh treatment, of children disciplined beyond reason, of tempers flaring during the stress of Holy Week preparations. These rumors were rarely confirmed, yet they carried weight because they echoed familiar patterns of abuse. Fear of being sold, beaten, or separated from loved ones kept most from speaking openly. Instead, tension settled like a heavy fog, thickening with each passing day. The master's family, too, lived with unease. Slaveholders often feared revenge, poisoning, or rebellion, especially during religious seasons believed to carry spiritual consequences. This paranoia only deepened the cycle of cruelty. Suspicion justified harsher control, while harsher control fueled deeper resentment. Within this environment, cruelty and tension fed each other endlessly. What appeared calm on the surface concealed emotional fractures ready to split. By Holy Week of 1858, the household was no longer simply strict, it was volatile, and in a city already steeped in superstition and fear, those hidden pressures would soon erupt into an act so shocking that even whispered rumors struggled to contain it. The night that would later be spoken of only in hushed tones arrived quietly, wrapped in the heavy stillness of Holy Week. New Orleans slept beneath candlelit windows and church bells long fallen silent, while inside the master's household, the familiar rhythm of control and obedience continued, at least on the surface. Nothing outward marked the evening as different, yet tension hung thick in the air, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. According to later whispers and fragmented accounts, this was not a moment of sudden madness, but the breaking point of pressures long endured. Years of fear, humiliation, and unacknowledged suffering converged into a single night. Esther, who had lived under constant surveillance and discipline, was said to have moved through the house as she always had, quietly, deliberately, unseen. What followed defied everything the household believed about order, obedience, and divine protection. The act itself was later described not in detail, but in stunned disbelief. It violated every boundary that slaveholders believed secured their power, the sanctity of family, the innocence of children, and the spiritual protection of Holy Week. When dawn approached, the house no longer felt like a place of authority, but of horror and confusion. Silence replaced certainty. Faith offered no immediate explanation. What made the night truly unthinkable was not only what happened, but when it happened. To many in the city, committing such an act during Holy Week was seen as a direct challenge to God Himself, a defiance that transformed personal tragedy into spiritual terror. It shattered the illusion that strict control could prevent vengeance, and it forced the community to confront a truth it feared most, that cruelty buried deep does not disappear. It waits. By morning, the household was forever changed. The night could not be undone, explained away, or cleansed by prayer. And in the days that followed, New Orleans would struggle to understand how a system built on fear had finally turned inward, producing an act that history would remember as unthinkable. The discovery came not with screams, but with a slow, creeping realization that something was terribly wrong. As morning light filtered into the master's household, routines that once symbolized order collapsed into confusion. Children who should have been present were missing. Rooms felt unnaturally quiet. What began as concern quickly turned into panic, and then into horror as the truth emerged piece by piece. Servants were questioned, movements retraced, prayers uttered in desperation. When the unthinkable was finally understood, the household descended into chaos. Faith offered no comfort in that moment, only disbelief and dread. The master's authority, once unquestioned, suddenly appeared fragile and powerless. Control had failed in the most devastating way possible. News spread rapidly beyond the household, carried by whispers rather than official statements. In a city like New Orleans, where rumors traveled faster than facts, the story grew darker with every retelling. Some spoke of divine punishment, others of hidden vengeance long ignored. The timing, Holy Week, amplified the shock. Many believed the tragedy carried spiritual consequences, that the house itself was now cursed. Esther was immediately isolated, her silence interpreted as guilt, defiance, or something more unsettling. She became less a person and more a symbol of fear, of rebellion, of a system unraveling under its own cruelty. There was no space for understanding her inner world, only a desperate need to restore order and assign blame. The immediate aftermath was marked by confusion, secrecy, and terror. Authorities moved carefully, aware that the truth threatened not just one household, but the illusion of safety upheld by slavery itself. What had been hidden behind closed doors was now impossible to contain. And from that moment on, nothing in the household, or in the city's collective conscience, would ever return to the way it was before. The reaction of the New Orleans community was immediate, intense, and deeply divided. In a city already shaped by superstition, religion, and fear, the story spread like a shadow at dusk, quietly at first, then impossible to ignore. Official details were scarce, but that absence only fueled speculation. Markets, church steps, and street corners became places of hushed conversation, where voices dropped low and eyes darted nervously before names were spoken. For the white, slaveholding population, the story struck at the heart of their greatest fear: loss of control. Many reacted with outrage and disbelief, framing the act as proof of what they claimed to fear all along, that enslaved people were dangerous, if not kept under constant discipline. Some called for harsh punishment, not only as justice, but as a warning meant to restore the illusion of safety. Others, more quietly, felt something closer to dread, sensing that the tragedy exposed cracks in a system they depended on but could no longer fully defend. Within the enslaved community, the reaction was far more complex and largely unrecorded. Open discussion was dangerous, yet the story passed in coded language and careful silences. Fear dominated, fear of collective punishment, increased surveillance, and brutal retaliation. At the same time, there was an unspoken recognition of the suffering that could drive a person to such extremes. Sympathy, terror, and shock existed side by side, but none could be voiced openly. Religious leaders struggled to explain the event. Some declared it a manifestation of evil, others warned of divine judgment, not just upon the individual, but upon a society steeped in cruelty, while preaching holiness. The fact that it occurred during Holy Week gave the story an almost supernatural weight. Many believed the city itself was marked, that something sacred had been violated beyond repair. As days passed, facts blurred into legend. Each retelling grew darker, more symbolic, less human. Esther's name became a whispered warning, and the household became a place people avoided. What began as a single tragedy transformed into collective horror, one that lingered in the city's memory, passed down not through records, but through fear-filled murmurs that refused to fade. What followed the horror was not clarity, but silence, an absence so deep it became one of the most unsettling parts of the story. In 1858 New Orleans, the legal system was designed to protect property and social order, not to document the inner truths of enslaved lives. Records that might have explained what truly happened were incomplete, deliberately vague, or never created at all. When enslaved people were involved, especially in cases that threatened the reputation of powerful families, details often vanished into obscurity. Court proceedings, if they occurred, were rarely transparent. Testimonies from enslaved individuals were considered unreliable or inadmissible, and any narrative that challenged the morality of slavery itself was quietly suppressed. Official documents focused on restoring order rather than uncovering causes. As a result, Esther's voice, her motives, her suffering, her perspective was erased almost entirely. What survives are fragments, second-hand accounts, rumors recorded years later, and gaps where truth should be. This legal silence was not accidental. A full accounting would have exposed uncomfortable realities about daily cruelty, psychological abuse, and the contradictions between Christian morality and human bondage. It was easier for authorities to reduce the story to a cautionary tale than to confront the system that produced it. Silence became a tool of control, preserving the illusion that such acts were rare anomalies rather than consequences of sustained oppression. For historians, these gaps are haunting. They force us to read between lines that were never written, to question whose stories were deemed worthy of preservation. The absence of records does not mean absence of cause. It signals deliberate forgetting. Esther's story exists today, not because it was carefully documented, but because it was too disturbing to disappear completely. In the end, the legal silence surrounding the case leaves more questions than answers. It transforms the tragedy into a shadowed space where certainty dissolves and where history itself seems complicit. What remains is not a verdict, but a void, one that speaks volumes about power, fear, and the cost of telling the truth in a society built on silence. Esther's legacy does not survive in monuments, official records, or neatly preserved archives. Instead, it lingers in the uneasy space between history and legend, where tragedy, terror, and unanswered questions collide. Over time, her name ceased to represent a single person and became something far more unsettling, a symbol of what slavery concealed, denied, and ultimately produced. To some, Esther was remembered only through fear. Her story was used as a warning, a justification for harsher control and deeper suspicion toward enslaved people. Slaveholders pointed to her name as proof of the dangers they claimed were always present, stripping the story of context and humanity. In this telling, Esther was reduced to a monster, her suffering erased, her life simplified into a single, horrifying act. But beneath that distorted legacy lies another truth. For those willing to look deeper, Esther represents the unbearable psychological toll of bondage. Her story exposes how years of dehumanization, silence, and cruelty can fracture the human spirit. She stands as a grim reminder that violence does not emerge from emptiness. It grows in environments where pain is ignored and voices are suppressed. The terror associated with her name reflects not just the act itself, but the fear of confronting the system that made it possible. As generations passed, the story shifted further into shadow. Facts blurred, details faded, and superstition filled the gaps. Some claimed the house was cursed. Others said Holy Week in New Orleans never felt the same. Whether believed as history or whispered as legend, the story endured because it touched something deeply uncomfortable, a truth society preferred not to face. Today, Esther's legacy forces us to reckon with what history often tries to bury. She is not easily understood, forgiven, or explained. She exists as a symbol of tragedy born from cruelty and terror born from silence. And in remembering her, we are reminded that the darkest stories are not only about what happened, but about the systems that allowed it, and the voices that were never allowed to speak.